All right, let's just jump right in because the title alone tells you this is not your typical war story. The codebreaker in the bathrobe. See, we're not talking about generals with perfect uniforms moving pins on a giant map. No, we're talking about a man in a worn-out bathrobe, working in a sweltering, forgotten basement, who held a secret that could literally turn the entire tide of the Second World War. A secret that would force a monumental choice: trust the system or trust the maverick. Now, I want you to really, honest-to-God, think about that for a second. Put yourself in those shoes. You, right now, possess the single most important piece of intelligence in the world. You know the enemy's next devastating move. But the very people you need to convince, the ones calling the shots, they think you're chasing ghosts. This wasn't some hypothetical. This was the crushing, day-to-day reality for a small, brilliant team of codebreakers in Hawaii in 1942. And their story is one of the most crucial, and for a long time intentionally buried, chapters of the entire war. To understand why their secret was so earth-shatteringly vital, we have to go back 6 months earlier, to December 7th, 1941. We have to stand in the smoking, twisted ruins of Pearl Harbor. Because on that day, America wasn't just wounded, it was psychologically shattered. The war in the Pacific didn't just look difficult. For all intents and purposes, it looked utterly unwinnable. That number? 2,403. It's so easy to just see it as a statistic, but it's not. It's 2,403 individual lives, each one violently extinguished in less than 2 hours. The heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was literally torn out. The USS Arizona, this mighty battleship just obliterated by a bomb that set off its ammunition, killing 1,177 men in a single, fiery instant. Can you imagine? And then there's the USS Oklahoma, which capsized so fast it trapped over 400 men inside. For days after the attack, rescuers could hear them hammering on the hull, a desperate, fading plea for help from inside a steel tomb. Until finally, there was only silence. This was the scale of the disaster, a psychic blow to an entire nation. You know, this quote from Admiral Nimitz, the man in charge of the Pacific Fleet, it just captures the sheer despair of that day. As he's standing there, watching his fleet burn, a stray bullet shatters the window of his office, missing him by inches. But his reaction wasn't relief, it was regret. He knew, in that instant, that his career was over, and that he would carry the blame, fairly or not, for America's greatest military catastrophe. That was the mood at the very top of command: utter, soul-crushing defeat. But amidst all that wreckage, there were a few critical facts that offered a tiny sliver of hope. By what you could only call a staggering stroke of luck, all 3 American aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were out at sea on missions and escaped the attack completely. This was huge. It pointed to a fundamental shift in warfare that almost no one had fully grasped yet. It was the carriers, not the mighty battleships now resting on the harbor floor, that would decide this war. The Japanese also made a massive strategic blunder by ignoring the huge fuel depots and the naval repair yards. And what that meant was that Pearl Harbor, the very scene of America's greatest defeat, could become the staging ground for its revenge. There was a chance, a slim one for sure, but it was there. And that chance? Well, it rested not on the decks of mighty ships, but deep underground, in a windowless, soundproofed, stiflingly hot basement known to its inhabitants as the dungeon. This was Station Hypo, the Navy's signals intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor. And it was right here, amidst the quiet hum of machinery and the frantic scratching of pencils, that the real war was about to be won or lost.
You see, the key to Japanese secrecy, the thing that allowed them to project power across the vast Pacific, was a code called JN-25. Now, this wasn't just some simple cipher. This was the crown jewel of Japanese intelligence. It was a masterpiece of encryption they considered absolutely, positively unbreakable. It gave them the power to coordinate massive naval operations with complete confidence that no one, anywhere, was listening in. And for a long, terrifying time after Pearl Harbor, they were right.
Just trying to break this thing was an intellectual nightmare. It's like trying to solve a puzzle that's inside another puzzle. First, you had to mathematically strip away this layer of thousands of random numbers called an additive. Only after you peeled that away could you even begin to look at the underlying 5-digit code group. And then, you had to figure out what that group meant by matching it to a code book with over 30,000 entries. Oh, and to make matters infinitely worse, the Japanese changed both the random numbers and the code books all the time. In fact, right before Pearl Harbor, they had introduced a brand new, way more complex version which plunged the Allied codebreakers back into almost total darkness.
Now the team tasked with this impossible job was led by a man who was as unconventional as the problem itself.
Upstairs at Fleet Command, you had the starched white uniforms, the strict military protocol, the rigid chain of command. But downstairs, in the dungeon, it was another universe entirely. The heat from the early computers, these IBM tabulating machines, was so intense that the unit's commander, Joseph Rochefort, famously worked in a bathrobe over his uniform with slippers on his feet. In his world, rank was totally irrelevant. Ideas were everything. A junior analyst could, and was absolutely expected to, challenge a senior officer, because the only thing that mattered was finding the truth hidden deep inside all that noise.
In this quote, this was Rochefort's guiding philosophy. It's a pretty radical concept in a military culture that's built on medals and promotions, right? He deliberately cultivated an environment where the mission was everything, and your personal ego was nothing. Rochefort himself was this strange kind of genius, a man with a mind for crossword puzzles who had spent years in Japan immersing himself in the language and the culture. This gave him an almost intuitive feel for the enemy's mindset. He put together this team of brilliant, exhausted misfits, linguists, mathematicians, even musicians, who, through sheer mental horsepower and a stubborn refusal to fail, began to painstakingly claw their way back inside JN-25.
So, by early May of 1942, Rochefort's team was starting to read just enough of the enemy's mail to hear whispers of another massive Japanese operation, one even bigger than Pearl Harbor. The decrypted fragments all seemed to point to a single primary target, a location they only knew by its code name, AF. The huge question was, what and where was AF? Answering that question would not only determine the fate of the war, it would ignite a brutal battle of wits, not against the Japanese, but against their own bosses in Washington, D.C.
And this is where the story really turns. It becomes a battle of the mavericks versus the bureaucracy. Rochefort and his team in the dungeon, analyzing things like radio traffic patterns and the subtle context of the messages, they were absolutely convinced AF was Midway Island, a tiny but strategically vital American outpost. But their superiors, back in Washington, at a unit called OP-20G, were just as convinced they were wrong. Washington believed the intelligence pointed to the Aleutian Islands, way up north, or maybe even another attack on Hawaii itself. And look, this wasn't some academic debate. The new Pacific Fleet commander, Admiral Nimitz, he only had 3 carriers left in his entire fleet. If he gambled on Rochefort's hunch and sent them to Midway, but Washington was right, the fleet would be ambushed and destroyed. The war would be over. Everything hinged on trusting the right team.
The pressure was just immense. You have to understand, powerful admirals in Washington viewed Rochefort as this eccentric, kinda insubordinate field officer. They had their own analysts, their own methods, and they had the full weight of the institution behind them. Rochefort was staking his entire career, and way more importantly, thousands of American lives, on his team's analysis of partial messages and what a lot of people saw as pure intuition. He needed proof. He needed something that no one, not even in Washington, could deny.
So what do you do? How do you prove your enemy's top secret intention when your own side refuses to believe you? You can't exactly call up the enemy and ask them, right? Or maybe you can. What Rochefort's team came up with next was a stroke of simple, elegant genius. A deception so clever it really does belong in a spy novel, yet it actually happened.
Okay, so the plan was incredibly simple, but just brilliant. Rochefort knew that Japanese intelligence stations listened to all Allied communications. So he arranged for the American base on Midway Island to send out a fake message in plain, unencrypted English over a cable they knew the Japanese were tapping. The message? That Midway's freshwater distillation plant was broken. It was the perfect bait. And sure enough, just 2 days later, the trap snapped shut. Station Hypo intercepted a new, coded Japanese message, and when they painstakingly decrypted it, the text read, AF is short of water. Game, set, match. They had their proof. They had literally tricked the enemy into revealing their own secret.
That was it. That was the moment, the smoking gun. And despite the continued, furious skepticism from Washington, Admiral Nimitz made one of the gutsiest calls of the entire war. He chose to trust the codebreaker in the bathrobe over the admirals in the Pentagon. He bet everything on Station Hypo. He knew where the Japanese were going, he knew when they would arrive, and thanks to Rochefort, he knew their entire order of battle. The trap was now set.
So now we arrive at the battle itself. This is the culmination of all that silent, thankless work down in the dungeon. It's the moment where all that intelligence met the cold, hard steel of reality. The Battle of Midway, a battle America, by all rights, should have lost.
I mean, just look at the odds here. The Japanese brought 4 veteran fleet carriers, the very same powerful ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor. America had just 3. And one of them, the USS Yorktown, had been so badly damaged in an earlier battle that she'd limped back to Pearl Harbor with people saying she'd need 3 months of repairs. Nimitz gave the yard crews 72 hours. In an almost miraculous feat of engineering and sheer will, 1,400 workers swarmed the ship, working around the clock. She sailed to Midway with repair crews still on board, literally welding plates onto her hull as she steamed into battle. Because of Rochefort's intelligence, Nimitz knew exactly where to hide his carriers to set up an ambush. So on the morning of June 4th, the Japanese struck Midway Island, just as predicted, completely unaware that an American fleet was lurking just over the horizon, waiting for them. And at exactly 10:22 a.m., after a series of chaotic and failed attacks, a squadron of American Dauntless dive bombers finally found the Japanese carriers.
And they found them at the exact perfect moment of maximum vulnerability. Their decks were packed with fully fueled and armed planes ready for a second strike. Their fighter patrols were out of position. Their defenses were in disarray. And in the space of just 6 minutes, 360 seconds, American bombs tore through the flight decks of 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, turning them into blazing, inescapable infernos. A 4th was found and sunk later that day. In 6 minutes, the tip of the Japanese spear was broken. The balance of naval power in the Pacific reversed. Forever. It's one of the most decisive victories in all of military history, and it was made possible by a secret from a basement.
So you'd think Joseph Rochefort would be celebrated as a national hero, right? Showered with medals, promoted to admiral. But this story, it doesn't end with a parade. For the man who won the Battle of Midway, the price of his genius and his bureaucratic insubordination was a legacy of silence and punishment.
The bureaucracy that he had bypassed to save the fleet got its revenge. The powerful admirals in Washington, who were embarrassed that a maverick commander in a basement had been right when they were so wrong, they just couldn't let it stand. Just 4 months after his incredible triumph, they had Rochefort removed from intelligence command. And his punishment? Reassignment to command a floating dry dock, a career-ending, dead-end job. And despite furious protests from Admiral Nimitz himself, who recommended him for the Distinguished Service Medal, the system crushed him. Rochefort's career was over. He died in 1976, having never received any official public recognition for his monumental achievement. It took another 10 years until President Ronald Reagan finally, posthumously, awarded him the medal he had earned 4 decades earlier.
But the work of his team at Station Hypo continued. That's a testament to the incredible culture he built. Their intelligence was absolutely crucial for the brutal campaign at Guadalcanal. It enabled the entire island-hopping strategy that pushed American forces across the Pacific. And, in one of the most famous targeted missions in history, in 1943, they intercepted the flight plans of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, which allowed American fighters to ambush and shoot down his plane. The impact of the dungeon was felt until the very last day of the war.
And that right there is why this story from 80 years ago still matters so profoundly today. It's this powerful reminder that history is often turned not by the loudest voices or the highest ranks, but by the quietest minds, by the brilliant, dedicated people working in obscurity on problems that seem impossible, often in defiance of the very systems they serve. So it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Who are the Joseph Rocheforts of today? Who are the men and women in their own modern-day dungeons, in cybersecurity labs, in intelligence agencies, and research foundations, working in silence right now to shape the course of our future?